Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Weekend Bible Study. Last episode we discussed and actually finished chapter 23 of the book of Deuteronomy. This week we hope to get through chapter 25. These chapters deal with a lot of miscellaneous laws, and in some cases perhaps even case law. What I mean by that is application of the law to a particular set of facts or situations and circumstances. I suspect Moses selected from what follows to show that the application of the underlying principles was very important in day-to-day life. As we study Moses' application of the law to real-life circumstances, I think there's a lot of lessons that we can glean, in particular in business dealings, which is dealt with at length in these passages. We have no questions this week, but if you do have questions about this episode or any prior episodes, please do not hesitate to email them to me at richard@borntowin.net. So with that, grab some coffee, and we'll get started after a short break. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and then if after she leaves his house and she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then the first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. This topic of divorce and remarriage has caused problems for generations. It's a very difficult subject, a very emotional subject, a very personal subject. It's important to understand that Moses did not institute or prohibit divorce. It's something he tolerated, and this is made very clear in the book of Matthew, chapter 19, verses 8 and 9. I'll go ahead and read parts of that. It says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. We learn some interesting things from this passage in Matthew that help clarify the passage in Deuteronomy. First, we learn that divorce was instituted because of the hardness of the people's heart. It wasn't the intent, it wasn't God's preference in any sense, but it was tolerated because of the situation with the people, the hardness of their heart. We also learn that the grounds for divorce were primarily limited to sexual immorality. There's not a laundry list of reasons that someone is permitted to divorce. Sexual immorality is pretty much it. And that clarifies what's meant in Deuteronomy when it says that if a husband finds something indecent about his wife, then he's permitted to divorce, and to actually give her a certificate of divorce, a writing, a decree, if you will, that she can have as proof of her freedom to marry another. Malachi chapter 2 also adds some interesting insight here to verses 15 through 17. I'll read parts of that as well. It says, Has not one God made you? You belong to him in body and spirit. And what does the one God seek? Godly offspring. So be on your guard and do not be unfaithful to the wife of your youth. The man who hates and divorces his wife, says the Lord, the God of Israel, does violence to the one he should protect, says the Lord Almighty. So be on your guard and do not be unfaithful. Some translators have, with respect to verse 16, have translated it, I hate divorce, meaning God hates divorce. And I don't know that that's an important distinction because the bottom line is God clearly has great disfavor for the institution. It's tolerated under certain circumstances, but it's disfavored. And it's interesting that the divorced woman who marries again is compared to or grouped in with others who commit adultery or other sexual sins. It's a defilement. So the aim is to regulate it here and not to have spouses and ex-spouses moving freely between themselves. Marriage was intended to be permanent, and divorce was as well. You get one bite at that apple, so to speak. And to enter into remarriage after a divorce is compared to adultery, which is equivalent to sexual sin in God's eyes. And God equates that to a defilement of the land. In our current culture, that should make us take pause. If sexual immorality defiles the land, it really begs the question, what kind of shape are we in today? And I think that's so apparent we don't need to dwell on it, but it should really make us stop and think. But I do think we should discuss for a moment, how should the church handle these very difficult situations today? I think the church is given some responsibility to deal with these situations. And what are we to make of these types of instructions? And I think very much it's a judgment call. It's a judgment call that should be made on a case-by-case basis, but it should be made with the underlying principle and understanding that God hates divorce, whether or not that's the correct translation of Malachi. I think it's pretty clear that He hates divorce. He hates what it does to families. He hates what it does to children. He hates what it does to the economy. As an attorney, I have witnessed the economic impact that divorce has. It creates cycles of poverty, economic difficulty, stress. It's just an institution that should be legal, but should be very rare. So with that being said, how do we make decisions? And I think that's something, again, that has to be handled on a case-by-case basis, should not be undertaken lightly, and should be handled primarily by the people who have to live with the decision, meaning the local congregation and the people that have to deal with it day by day. And it's a very difficult topic, and it's something that we all understand is very emotional and something that the church just has to deal with. That's just the reality that we live with. So we have to do it with wisdom, a lot of prayer, and with as much understanding as possible. Verse 5. If a man has recently married, he must not be sent to war or have any other duty laid on him. For 1 year he is to be free to stay at home and bring happiness to the wife he has married. Compare this with Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 7, where a man who has been engaged is fully exempt from military duty. We get some interesting insight into the way God views romantic love. Obviously, He puts some value on this. He understands that this is an important aspect of any marriage, and it's a blessing that should be experienced, if possible, by all. God is not a prude when it comes to these things, very clearly. And there may have been some other purposes as well, just very practical. It may have been better not to have a bunch of lovesick, newlywed young men in the barracks during the time of battle. And then secondarily, we can see that if someone would be allowed to be with his wife during that first year, it would have greatly increased the odds that an heir would have been born that would have protected inheritance rights. And inheritance rights are discussed in greater detail as we go through these chapters. So the purposes are pretty apparent in this. Verse 6. Do not take a pair of millstones, not even the upper one, as security for a debt, because that would be taking a man's livelihood as security. I think most of you understand what a millstone is. Millstones would have been used to grind grain. The upper millstone would have been easier to remove, obviously because of its position. But even this was not to be removed, because without it, the lower millstone would not work. And milling grain was essential to a family's sustenance. But here's the bigger principle at work here. God is simply saying, do not engage in oppressive lending practices. There are different types of loans. You have loans that are secured and unsecured loans. A secured loan is a loan where collateral is pledged to ensure payment of the loan. So God is not saying you can't have secured loans. He's simply saying you can't engage in oppressive lending tactics when it comes to your collateral. And this theme will be reiterated in subsequent passages. Under Texas law, and I would suspect it's similar in other states, that you are not allowed to take a person's tools of their trade. If you have a debt, if they owe a debt to you, you cannot go in, for instance, seize a carpenter's tools, his tool belt, because it's just a basic understanding that if you take away those basic things, the family's sustenance will be threatened. And you can see these ideas from Deuteronomy really have obviously influenced our laws, and certainly in Texas, and I would guess in other states as well. Verse 7. If a man is caught kidnapping one of his brother Israelites and treats him as a slave or sells him, the kidnapper must die. You must purge the evil from among you. We understand that kidnapping would be involuntarily taking someone's freedom. And this was a capital offense in Israel. It brought about the death penalty. But what I think is interesting here is what God says later in the verse. It says that you must purge this evil. You must have a zero tolerance for it. This is such an evil thing to take someone's freedom that those who engage in it must not be left around to perpetuate even implicitly the practice by their very presence. This may have been also in part to discourage temple prostitution, other types of slavery, which, as Mr. Dart has discussed in previous sessions, would have largely involved children and women and those in society who are most vulnerable to being enslaved. And God clearly has zero tolerance for this, and it's interesting that the implication here is that it should be dealt with swiftly and decisively. These kinds of discussions often remind me of debates that we used to have in law school. When you're in law school, you have the luxury to sit around and discuss abstract topics that don't have a lot of day-to-day application, but they're fun to discuss. And one of the things we discussed at great length was the purpose of and the effectiveness of the death penalty. And one of the main arguments against the death penalty, and some that frankly has some merit, is that there's very little evidence that it actually acts as a deterrent in our society. But you have to step back and ask, if that's true, why is that true? And it's primarily true because it takes so long for the penalty to be imposed. The penalty is so far removed from the actual event that the causal relationship is often lost, and the consequences don't really seem real. It would be interesting to me to see if these things were imposed swiftly and fairly, but swiftly, decisively. I would believe it would have some effect of deterrent. I guess that's just a debate that we'll have to have at another time. But when it comes at least to God's way of thinking, He's very pragmatic and frankly very unemotional about these things. I suspect that the death penalty in God's economy would be administered very quickly, and as such would become a major deterrent to these types of activities that God understood and explains to us to be evil. They can't be tolerated. You can't negotiate. You can't flirt with this type of evil. It has to be purged. Verse 8. In cases of leprous diseases, be very careful to do exactly what the priests, who are Levites, instruct you. You must follow carefully what I have commanded them. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam along the way after you came out of Egypt. What's really interesting about this, I think it's well understood that leprosy and other skin diseases are very infectious, and you must be very careful to quarantine and to be careful that these are not quickly spread. But I think the real point of this is that God expects a nation to respect and obey civil authority. God says, be very careful to do what the priests say. And remember, the priests function in this society sort of like the county health commissioner. They were responsible to decide when quarantine was necessary and to make sure that basic health and sanitation was being followed. Numbers 12, remember, if you'd like to go there, is the story, the book of Numbers chapter 12, the story of Miriam and Aaron, who spoke out against Moses. And God caused Miriam to become leprous. He was very upset with this situation that they presumed to speak out against God's chosen one in Moses. And by drawing this comparison, God really emphasizes the importance of respect for the civil authority. We see this idea reinforced by Jesus when He said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, when speaking about the obligation to pay taxes in the Gospels. The Apostle Paul reinforces this idea when he says, give honor and custom to whom it's due. And certainly our civil leaders, until the time that they become so corrupt that it's totally incompatible with obedience to God's law, which for most of us is not the case if we're honest with ourselves, until it gets to that point, it is our God-given duty to have respect for the civil authority. It's interesting that earlier this week was April 18th, which was the tax deadline here in America. Normally it's April 15th, but because of a certain federal holiday with respect to the Emancipation Proclamation, it was pushed forward till Monday, April 18th. And this is a good example where it's very difficult as a Christian. Obviously, very few of us enjoy paying taxes, but it is sort of the price we pay to be a citizen. And while I think Christians should be very wise, we are to be wise as serpents and harmless as doves, and the wisdom of a serpent would be not to pay any more tax than we are required, certainly, but to be known as someone who cheats on their taxes is thoroughly incompatible with what we're learning here in Deuteronomy and from the words of Jesus and as well the words of Paul. So have respect for the civil authority, as difficult as that may be at some times. Verse 10, when you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, do not go into his house to get what he is offering you as a pledge. Stay outside and let the man to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. If the man is poor, Do not go to sleep with his pledge in your possession. Return his cloak to him by sunset, so that he may sleep in it. Then he will thank you, and it will be regarded as a righteous act in the sight of the Lord your God. Well, I guess we learn here that the expression that someone may take the clothes off your back was literal in this society, that you could literally pledge your coat as collateral for a loan. And again, God is not saying you can't have secured loans, but He's saying you can't be overreaching or oppressive in collecting your collateral. You can't go and harass someone in their home, which is something that's sacred to someone, their home. It should be a place of peace, and God's saying you cannot invade that to collect collateral. And I find that very interesting as an attorney, again, practicing in Texas, where we have very, I would say, liberal, and Texas is known as a conservative state, but our laws with respect to debt collections are quite liberal. It's very clear under Texas law and as well a similar federal statute that you're not allowed to, for instance, harass someone at certain hours of the day over a debt. When you call, you're not allowed to call very early in the morning or very late at night. You're not allowed to go into their home absent a court order, for instance, in certain circumstances allowing you to go take your collateral. There's a certain respect and dignity that must be given to the debtor. And we see, again, Deuteronomy, once again, these ideas flowing through some of our laws with respect to debt collection practices. Now, some of you capitalists out there may be thinking, well, how is that fair to the lender? The lender made the loan. And I understand that because I've represented lenders. I see it from their perspective as well. But I would simply say this. Lenders in this society, as well as lenders today, they know the rules going in. And if they're that worried about collecting the loan that they feel like the only way they'll make that loan is if they will be allowed to use unreasonable, overly aggressive collection tactics, if that's what you're left with, maybe you shouldn't make the loan. To me, that seems like a reasonable way to approach it and more in line with what God would say on the subject. Verse 14, do not take advantage of a hired man who is poor and needy, whether he is a brother Israelite or an alien living in one of your towns. Pay him his wages each day before sunset, because he is poor and is counting on it. Otherwise he may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. God is amazing, really. He thinks of everything, if you will. He understands and made provision for the fact that poor people have cash flow problems. They're, as the old expression goes, they live on money they ain't made yet. And I've been there. I can remember during law school, I can remember counting the change in my console of my car, seeing if I had enough change to buy a taco at Taco Bell. We understand that getting that wage on time is very important. So God is simply saying, pay the wage daily. This will alleviate some of the stress of cash flow problems that poor people experience, and all of us have sometimes experienced as well. In Texas, and again in most other states, we have what we call payday statutes, where it's actually a crime not to pay wages on the day they're due. As an employer, you have to make that clear to your employees. Do we pay weekly? Do we pay biweekly? How do we pay? And then you have to stick to that, and it can be a very serious consequence if you don't, because the stress that can occur is very hard to quantify. It can just be very traumatic not to be paid on time. So be attuned to, the point here is to be attuned to the plight of the poor. Don't oppress them. Be courteous to them. Think about their situation and don't make it more difficult. Now let's contrast this idea to how we treat poor people today in our society. Drive through any poor neighborhood, at least in Texas, and you will see signs for what they call payday loans, where someone who's having cash flow problems can go in and get a very high interest loan to get an advance on their paycheck. It's secured against the paycheck that they'll soon get paid. So they get in this never-ending cycle where they're paying high interest. Again, that violates all the godly principles of not charging usury to the poor, and they're having to pay this interest just to survive on these payday loans. Another example that just happened recently to me, my law firm, we do pro bono work, which means that we represent the indigent in certain legal cases at no charge to them. It's part of what we're expected to do. And I know of a situation where we recently helped a man settle a case, and it was a small matter, but he received a small settlement of money as part of the working out the dispute. And I realized when we handed him the check, he got a little nervous and he was afraid to ask, but I could tell what was going through his mind. Something was going through his mind. I wasn't sure what. But it turns out that he didn't have a bank account. He wasn't able to have a bank account, and he was concerned about cashing this check, and it was a small check, because he said that to go cash the check at one of these payday places, they were going to charge him $100 just to cash the check. You can see that unfortunately in our society, we too often do just the opposite of what God instructed instead of helping the working poor, meaning the folks that are trying to work, like in this situation in Deuteronomy 15. If you're paying the wage, the poor person is working. And instead we make it more difficult on these people by not allowing them to get ahead. And it's just something that really should be much to our shame. Verse 16, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their fathers. Each is to die for his own sin. Let's call this the law of individual responsibility. Quite simply, you are not to be punished for the crimes of others, but only for your own crimes. Now, naturally, there's some stigma that will attach to a family for the crimes of our fathers, our brothers, and our relatives. But in the literal sense, at least, there would be no punishment attached to that person. And it seems apparent enough that this is this is justice. And I know in life sometimes the apple does fall far from the tree, and we shouldn't hold against a person the sins of their forefathers. Verse 17, do not deprive the alien or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. This idea is repeated throughout the book of Deuteronomy, and so by emphasis through repetition, I think we get the understanding that this is very important to God. Simply put, we are to protect and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. Do not take advantage of the most vulnerable in the society, and those would be the aliens, the orphans, and the widows. They should not be taken advantage of in civil matters. They should be given justice, and they should not be taken advantage of in economic matters. They should not be oppressed in the types of lending practices and different things. And why would this be? It's very practical. God really understands the way the world works. Folks in these categories would have two big disabilities working against them that would affect a lot of the outcomes in their lives. First, aliens, orphans, and widows would tend to be impoverished. And secondarily, they would tend to lack access into what we might say today the political mainstream, or access into the establishment. I would guess it's much harder for the fatherless to get into Harvard and do those types of things. They would be kind of on the outside looking in. And God is simply saying, hey, Israel, remember, you once were on the outside looking in. You were slaves in Egypt, so don't turn around now and oppress some other people now that the tables are turned. Learn the lesson, have empathy, and do things the right way. As we discussed briefly in last episode, our U.S. Supreme Court has ruled repeatedly that the basic rights of due process, in particular the ones embedded in the 14th Amendment, that property and life cannot be taken without due process, that these protections apply to aliens. Even if you are not a citizen, you still are entitled to these basic protections. And let's give our Supreme Court some credit. They at least got that much right. Interestingly, too, you may want to refer to James chapter 1, verse 27, where it says, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So if we do nothing more than this as Christians in our day-to-day lives and our service to others, we could do a lot worse than simply respecting and helping the fatherless and the widows. Verse 19, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all your work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the alien, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. We see the same theme repeated again. Protect the widow, the fatherless, and the alien. This was a type of welfare system that's being alluded to here in this passage, that poor persons were permitted, if they were willing to do just a little bit of work, to eat what was left over after the harvest in the fields. But this system would obviously break down if the fields and the trees were totally picked clean. God is just simply saying, leave a little on the table. And why? Because Israel, don't forget you were once an alien and a stranger in a land where you were oppressed, where you were vulnerable to being exploited. Don't turn around now and do this to someone else. I remember an old preacher one time said to his daughter, he was telling a story that he told his daughter that the best way to know if a young man would make a good husband is to consider how he treats old people, small children, and animals. Well, to paraphrase that, I think you can tell a lot about how godly a nation is when you simply ask, how do they treat those that are most vulnerable, the aliens, the widows, and the orphans? Good food for thought. We'll take a short break and come back and review Deuteronomy chapter 25. When people have a dispute, they are to take it to court, and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. If the guilty person deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make them lie down and have them flogged in his presence with the number of lashes the crime deserves. But the judge must not impose more than 40 lashes. If the guilty party is flogged more than that, your fellow Israelite will be degraded in your eyes. Quite simply, if you have a dispute that cannot be resolved, you need to take it to court. This was not a society where vigilante justice was tolerated. It was a nation under the rule of law. And apparently this refers not to capital offenses, but to less serious disputes. And the judge had some latitude to impose a punishment as long as it did not exceed 40 lashes. So really the point is just simply the punishment should fit the crime and should never be inhumane. Verse 4. Do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. This particular verse seems to come a little out of left field, and it doesn't seem to have a lot of direct application maybe to us today, but I think as we go through this we'll see that it does. Let's understand at the time that oxen were often harnessed to a central pivot point, and then grain would be laid on the floor, and the ox would then walk in a circle, and as its hooves stepped on the stalks of grain, the grain would be separated. It was just simply a type of threshing process. And the command is not to muzzle the ox while this is occurring or prevent it from periodically taking a break to eat some of the grain that's separated from the stalk. The point is simply treat animals, in particular animals that work for you on the farm, with kindness. Treat them well and they will treat you well. This is a perfect example, though, of something that appears not to have direct application, but when we step back and look at the underlying principle, we see that it does have a lot of direct application, even for us today. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and begin reading in verse 6, where Paul is discussing here his ministry, and he makes some very interesting comments, and let's just read it. It speaks for itself. Verse 6. Or is it only I and Barnabas that we do not have the right to refrain from working? In other words, do we have to work to support our ministry while others don't? Other apostles apparently were not required to work. Why is it only the two of us that have to do this? Verse 7. Does anyone at any time serve a soldier as a soldier at his own expense? Does anyone plant a vineyard and not eat the fruit thereof? Or does anyone shepherd a flock and not eat the meat and the milk of the flock? Am I saying these things merely from a human point of view, or does not the law say the same things? For it is written, you shall not muzzle the ox that is treading out corn. Is it because God is concerned for the oxen? Verse 9 is very interesting because it's a direct quote from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. And Paul is making the point here that the principle applies to those that work for you in the church, that they're entitled to a reasonable living wage, if you will, and should not be treated poorly. And we see the principle very clearly applies here. And it's a good example of how we can take some of these passages from the law, in the book of Deuteronomy in particular, that seem obscure and without application. But when we step back and think what was really the underlying purpose, we see that there is much application even for us today. Verse 5. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. Now again, this is something that seems a little strange to us, and it has to be put into an historical context. Land in Israel was to be allotted in Canaan among tribes, clans, and families. So this law had a twofold purpose. It first was to protect the land of the family of the deceased brother. If a man died without offspring and his widow married outside of the family, it would have had the tendency over time for a family to make it difficult for the family to retain its allocation of land as non-family members came into possession. Possession being 9/10 of the law, as the old expression goes. There's some truth to that once someone is in possession, that possession tends to perpetuate itself. And we understand that to this day, perhaps the greatest source of wealth is real estate. Unlike so much of what we value, land has intrinsic value, and it is a limited resource, and it was very important that families were able to keep this resource intact, or otherwise poverty would be perpetuated throughout the generations. It needed to be protected. And I think secondarily, it also had a purpose of protecting widows. Remember, there was no institutional welfare system, very limited job opportunities for a widow in this culture. And so for the brothers of the deceased man to help take care of the widow really had a very practical effect to make sure the widow did not become destitute. And we've seen throughout the book of Deuteronomy that widows are to be protected. For instance, you cannot make secured loans to a widow for household needs. So again, this is a segment of society that God was very concerned about. But let me step back and mention something that's very interesting to me. That although this is translated son here, I think it's quite likely that really it's son meant in the sense of offspring. And let me explain why I think this is true. Let's go to Numbers chapter 27 and read a very interesting story that I think will help bring this point out. Numbers chapter 27, verse 1. Then came the daughters of Zelophehad, the son of Helpher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, of the families of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. And these are the names of his daughters, Mahlah, Noah, and Hoglah, and Milcah, and Tirzah. And they stood before Moses, these daughters, before Eleazar the priest, and before the leaders of the congregation by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, Our father died in the wilderness, and was not in the company of those who gathered themselves against the Lord in the company of Korah, but died in his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from among his family because he had no son? Therefore give us a possession among the brothers of our father. And Moses brought their case before the Lord. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, It is right for the daughters of Zelophehad to speak. You shall surely give them a possession of an inheritance among their father's brothers, and you shall cause the inheritance of their father to pass to them. And you shall speak to the children of Israel, saying, When a man dies and he has no son, then you shall cause his inheritance to pass to his daughter. And if he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. And if he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if the father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest relative of the family, and he shall possess it. And it shall be to the children of Israel a statute of judgment, as the Lord commanded Moses. Very interesting. When you read through this in Numbers 27, this reads a lot like modern-day intestacy statutes. For instance, in the state of Texas, in what we call our probate code, it lays out very clearly how property is to descend to the relatives of a deceased person who dies without a will. And it reads strikingly like this. So it's interesting. You can see the influence of the law, biblical law, on our current practices even today. But the point I want to make here is just to emphasize how progressive really God is when it comes to the protection of women's rights. Women were able to inherit property if there was no brother to inherit. And this would have been very much ahead of its time in this culture, and I think it gives you some idea of what was meant here going back to Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 and 6, where we see that when it's referenced as son, I think the intent here is really offspring, that if there's no offspring, if a widow is left with no offspring, then it's the duty of the brother-in-law to come in and correct that situation, if you will. Verse 7, However, if a man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, My husband's brother refuses to carry out his brother's name in Israel. he will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of his sandals, and spit in his face, and say, This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. The man's line shall be known in Israel as the family of the unsandaled. Interestingly, a man had a way out here. This was something that would not be forced upon a man. And you can imagine circumstances where a man might not want to undertake his duty. However, if a widow was so inclined, she could have brought him before the court in great shame. He would be spit upon and labeled the family of the unsandaled. So a man could be released from the duty, but the practice was definitely discouraged. And like all good laws, the right incentives and disincentives need to be there, and clearly this was a practice that God wanted to be encouraged, and so hence the humiliation that would occur if a man opted not to fulfill his duty. Verse 11, If two men are fighting, and the wife of one of them comes to rescue her husband from his assailant, and she reaches out and seizes him by his private parts, you shall cut off her hand and show no pity. I suspect this was case law. It's my impression that this was a law directed at a specific situation or set of facts, because I have to conclude this would not be the type of thing that was happening on a daily basis in Israel. And I don't think it also referred to a situation where a man was minding his own business and then had been assaulted without provocation. I think it more refers to a situation where a man has somewhat voluntarily submitted himself to this type of combat. And even in our laws today, that there's a difference between how someone is treated who voluntarily agrees to fist fight, if you will, versus how someone who's being assaulted without allowing it or volunteering for it. But what is really interesting here is that it does not seem to prohibit a wife from intervening or taking other actions. I mean, the law doesn't prohibit, for instance, a woman from hitting the assailant over the head with a frying pan, or perhaps kicking him in a very sensitive area. I think really what's being said here is that this particular very specific behavior that's described is particularly shameful and indecent, and it just shouldn't be tolerated. And I think the underlying principle is that God values modesty when it comes to sexual matters, and a wife would just simply in this situation have to find another way to help her husband who's in the midst of a beatdown, so to speak. Verse 13. Do not have two differing weights in your bag, one heavy, one light. Do not have two differing measures in your house, one large, one small. You must have accurate and honest weights and measures, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. For the Lord your God detests anyone who does these things, anyone who deals dishonestly. This describes what is probably one of the oldest scams in the book. A merchant using false weights to make what he is buying or selling appear heavier or lighter depending on which was to his advantage in that particular transaction. We see this today. I just even recently was on the internet and saw that there's a lot of what they call gas pump fraud. And even some states even have hotlines that you can call to discuss this or to report it. And what some proprietors do at gas stations is that they'll misadjust the pump to dispense gasoline inaccurately so that it appears more has been dispensed. You're paying for gasoline that hasn't actually been dispensed. You know, it seems like that's nickel and dime, but when you multiply that over society hundreds and thousands of times, you can see the hidden costs, the costs that are embedded into all the goods and services we buy as a result of dishonesty. Think of the cost, the audits, the regulations, the lawyers that all get involved in trying to limit dishonesty. As a lawyer, a good part of what I spend my day doing is reviewing and drafting contracts. And in almost every contract, there's some sections that deal with what happens if one party has been dishonest or if there's fraud, made misrepresentations. I spend a lot of time dealing with that particular subject. If this was taken out of the equation, if it could just be assumed that in business practices people would be honest and basically fair, how much money, time, and other resources would be saved? And believe me, these costs are passed on to the consumer. We all suffer as a result of the dishonesty at large in the business community. And if we would simply do things God's way, we not only would be much happier, we would probably be much more prosperous. Verse 17. Remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land He is giving you to possess as an inheritance, you shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven, and do not forget, with an exclamation point. The Amalekites were the descendants of Esau, very close cousins, therefore, of Israel. But unlike Israel, they are described as a people without any fear of God. They are described as a tribe that had no hesitation to attack those that lagged behind as Israel was making its journey through the land. Who would have been lagging behind? Well, obviously the elderly, the injured, women, children. They would have attacked the most vulnerable in the society. Just the opposite of the values God has been extolling all through this section of Deuteronomy, that those are the ones, the elderly, the women, the children, the aliens, that the ones who are most vulnerable should be the ones who are protected. But yet the Amalekites had no pity. Simply put, they were evil. And we see this principle that God does not want us to compromise with evil, but to purge it. We see that in the example earlier in Deuteronomy 24, when those who would kidnap fellow Israelites were to be purged. Capital punishment was to be applied. And God is simply saying that apparently the Amalekites were incorrigible and beyond redemption, at least in this lifetime, and therefore the evil needed to be purged, it needed to be dealt with. And this is hard for us to understand, to write off a whole family, if you will. But I think we have to understand that we don't see things from God's perspective. He sees things in an eternal context. He knows that there will be times and opportunities to deal with everyone. But in the meantime, when He's dealing with the nation of Israel, as He's sort of their Secretary of State, He has a very steely-eyed, unemotional view of these things. He's a little more cynical maybe even than we are about human nature, and He understands that evil cannot be compromised with. It has to be dealt with. Well, this has been an interesting discussion, but since we've already talked about religion today, I'll save the political discussion for another time. This is Richard Crowe signing off, and look forward to seeing you next time.